Hi everyone, I'm Beth Solon. Video went off. Hey everyone, my name is Beth Solon. I'm the co-director of Climate Interactive. Really happy to be here with you today for this webinar, as Cassandra said, on multi-solving. So using En-ROADS to make connections to health, equity, justice, and well-being. And the reason that we have this webinar, honestly, is that of course, the climate being a complex system made up of the planet and the atmosphere and carbon and political systems and economic systems exists embedded in a much wider fabric of society. And many of the levers in En-ROADS have implications for good or for bad for other things that are as important as climate change is, whether that's the health of children or the sufficiency of the food supply or population health or equity or justice. And so when we use En-ROADS with groups, we want to be able to bring some of those connections in. And so this webinar really aims just to help you start seeing strategies to make some of these connections in your facilitation. And I'm gonna turn to my browser for a second here. Did anyone else see this headline today? This is from today's New York Times. The headline says, "Climate change tied to pregnancy risks affecting Black mothers most." So they took a look at a record of 32 million births in the United States, and they found that high temperature, so think climate change, think especially the impact of heat waves in cities on urban populations, high temperatures or air pollution are women who are exposed to these in their pregnancies are more likely to have premature, underweight, or stillborn babies. So, you know, this one headline caught my attention just because it really encapsulates what we want to talk about today, the fact that climate change is embedded against us with a set of other problems and issues. And there's two sides to this. One is the risk that if we address climate change, you know, in our policy, but even in our education and advocacy with En-ROADS, if we do that education and advocacy in a vacuum from these other factors, there's a real ethical problem with that, right? Because we're leaving off really important considerations that are matters of life or death for people. So that's the risk. The opportunity is that when you start to see how climate change and fossil fuels are connected to all these other issues, you start to also see potential allies to tackle these problems together. So in this one case, you have everyone who cares about children, everyone who cares about mothers, everyone who cares about racial equity, everyone who cares about other diseases impacted by air pollution. And so the opportunity, if we're really skillful at making connections, is that we can build the power of our movements for change. And so that's that kind of thinking and seeing these kind of connections is what we want to explore over the next hour. Before we really dive in, just to remind you where you are in this progression. So we're more than halfway through now. You've got an introduction to En-ROADS. You've seen different ways to use it interactively. You've gone deeper into some of the dynamics. Here we are talking about multi-solving, and then two sessions to go, advanced facilitation, and then confidence building, testing, and model science. I think you're all used to this by now, but just remind you, if you have urgent questions right now during the webinar, or if you have technical problems, use that questions field within the GoToWebinar interface, and a whole bunch of my colleagues are there and will do their best to help you. And then if you have longer term questions or ideas or thoughts, remember support@climateinteractive.org is a great email address to send those to. So we want to get into this territory of making connections between climate, health, equity, justice, and well-being. And we're going to start that in kind of an interactive way. And so just like the first headline I started with, we're gonna look at another headline. This one is about 2 months old, I think, and it's from research at the Harvard School of Public Health. And folks there, researchers found that air pollution levels, high air pollution levels, are linked to a higher COVID-19 death rate. Okay, so this is obviously really pertinent to our current moment in the middle of a pandemic. And my question for you is, okay, so that's an interesting headline. What does it have to do with climate change? So how does this headline, air pollution linked with higher COVID-19 death rates, how does that connect to climate change? And to make that interactive and just getting ourselves sharing that a little bit, use the question box and type in your thoughts on how these two topics connect. And Cassandra will read out your ideas. So how does this headline, air pollution linked with higher COVID-19 death rates, connect to climate change? And Cassandra, as soon as you start seeing things, you can just read them out. All right. So again, if you're just catching up or you just arrived, air pollution has been shown. Okay, great. Why don't you just start reading them out?
Air pollutants are often a result of fossil fuel combustion. So combusting fossil fuels increases emissions, which leads to climate change. Respiratory issues linked to fossil fuel combustion. Increases urban heat island, someone said.
Okay, so yeah, so people are making the connection. What I'm hearing is air pollution comes from fossil fuels, climate change comes from fossil fuels, and that was the same connection that that occurred to me. So I made a really simple systems diagram of the sort that sometimes you might have seen in some of the other sessions when we talk about dynamics in En-ROADS. Remember that each of these arrows means causation. So burning fossil fuels causes or leads to air pollution. The S here means same, so an increase in fossil fuels causes a change in air pollution in the same direction. More fossil fuels burned means more air pollution. Those Harvard researchers say means a higher risk of people dying from the virus. And of course, we know that burning fossil fuels produces CO2, which contributes to climate change. And so for many of the issues that we're going to talk about in this next hour, you're going to either mentally in your head have some sort of picture like this in your mind, that if you trace these causal links back far enough, you'll find some common source. And sometimes that source is fossil fuels. When we talk about air pollution, there's a second layer, because of course air pollution is deadly on its own, not just in the context of the coronavirus. The World Health Organization says 8 million deaths per year come from air pollution worldwide. And we know that around the world, who's exposed to that air pollution is inequitable. So here in the United States, there's plenty of evidence that people with less power, communities with less power, here that often means communities of color or low wealth communities, are disproportionately exposed to air pollution. A study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019, in fact, it found that white Americans produce more air pollution through their economic activity than they're exposed to. And for people of color in America, it's the opposite. They are exposed to more air pollution than they produce. So already here, and we've just been talking a few minutes, you can start to see the connections, right? We've got fossil fuels, we've got air pollution, health, climate change, and now equity kind of spread in a layer across all of that. Let's just do one more warm up in that same spirit. So here's another headline that caught my eye. And it's not just Canada that's doing this. All around the world, cities and governments at all levels are trying to take waste food and repurpose it, somehow channel it to meet the food insecurity, which we know is rising at record levels due to the economic disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Canada is trying to divert food waste to help feed people. And same question for you again, how does this headline connect to climate change? Give it a little thought, put your ideas in the questions box. What does food waste have to do with climate change? And how does addressing food waste connect to addressing climate change? And while we're waiting for Cassandra to get some answers there, I would also just say this is a great you know, like brain teaser. You're sitting somewhere, you're scrolling, you see a headline. Good practice is if you want to really be a facile connector of climate change to other issues, do this little mental exercise. And of course, not everything in the world is going to connect to climate change, but I think you'll be surprised how much does. What are we seeing, Cassandra?
We've gotten wasted food is wasted energy. So reduced food waste saves energy. Methane, the methane from decomposing food waste. Increased garbage, which leads to increased litter and plastic pollution.
Great.
Should I keep going?
Yeah, so well, I think that gives us a flavor. So what we're hearing, it takes energy, it creates other kinds of emissions too, the production of food. So the more food that's wasted, the more emissions are associated with food, because we've got to produce more food to feed everyone. So if you can reduce food waste in that way, you can simultaneously address food insecurity and address climate change. And then the other idea I didn't include on this diagram, but it's a good one to name, is that particularly if food waste is decomposes anaerobically, it produces methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So multiple connections that say if we can reduce food waste, we can solve multiple problems at the same time. So let's just take that one step further and hop over to En-ROADS here. So I'm going to pull up En-ROADS. Which by now I think is really familiar to all of you. You're getting acquainted with all of these levers. And let's just keep practicing for one or two more tries here. So let's say that we reduce the use of coal by taxing it. So we get a little bit of an improvement over here on temperature change. That's the long-term improvement. But now we want to think for a minute, what else might get better in the short term if less coal is burned? And we can look here at this diagram, the primary energy demand for coal. You see the use of coal falling off. So same idea, put into the chat box, what other benefits might come along with a change like that, and who would benefit from that sort of change? Okay, so you're asking yourself, there's less coal. We know that means less greenhouse gas emissions, means less temperature change. But what else might it mean for individuals or communities?
Land and rivers would not be destroyed.
Okay, so land and rivers might not be destroyed. So someone there is thinking about probably the point of extraction where coal is mined, right? And how, both mountaintops are cleared off and water is polluted by chemicals involved in the extraction of coal. Anything else?
Better health, less asthma.
Okay, better health, less asthma.
Would it lead to?
Go ahead.
Lead to more renewable energy jobs, less cancer.
All
the
right.
environment around coal mines would be better.
All right, so we could keep going, but that's a good selection. And you can already picture in your head, right, this sort of spider web kind of diagram here, right? Because now we're talking about waters and communities where coal is extracted, but then we're talking about asthma and respiratory illness where coal might be burned. And then we're talking about potential new jobs to produce energy that's going to replace that coal energy. And that could be somewhere really far from the site of extraction of that coal. So that's the kind of thinking behind what we at Climate Interactive have taken to calling multi-solving. So multi-solving is when one action produces multiple solutions. And we just looked at this one, right? You burn less coal. For the long term, that's going to protect the climate, less greenhouse gas emissions. And in the short term, it's going to improve health. And here I was thinking mostly about the air pollution idea that one of you mentioned. We could make this diagram even more complicated if we were to put some of those other improvements like the ecosystem improvements, the water protection, and so on. We say the definition of multi-solving is changing lives for the better while protecting the climate. And we think about multi-solving in terms of 6 areas. There could well be more, but over the years, as we've looked at these co-benefits, we think that if you remember 6 basic categories, you're going to do a pretty good job at capturing a lot of the potential. So each of these are benefits that can, but don't always, but can come along with investments or policies that protect the climate. So food security or food access and clean water, that's the first category. Jobs and economic opportunity and wealth building and assets, that's the second category. Health, well-being, and safety. We've seen examples of that already just here in the last couple minutes. Connection, we think, is an important one that covers both people's connection to nature, but also connection to each other, connection within communities, community coherence or connectedness. Energy, industry, and mobility. So this is the category of just access to energy and all the things it does to improve our lives. Industry, the ability to make things. Mobility, the ability to move around our environment and get where we need to be. And then resilience, the ability to withstand shocks. These might be climate impacts or other kinds of shocks as well. So keep those 6 categories in mind, and as you're working with En-ROADS, a good question in the back of your mind is, like, how many of these categories of co-benefits might come along with that climate protecting action. One thing that we found is that multi-solving stays as a bit of an abstraction for people until you start telling stories about them. And then it's kind of intuitive and common sense. And so we've invested a lot of our effort into capturing and cataloging and telling the stories of multi-solving projects. And we've also done our best to turn these into resources like slides that you all can use. And so we'll put in the links and I'll tell you a bit more on the website where to find some of this. But first, let's just focus on a couple examples. So this is one of my favorites. It comes from the UK and it's a program called Walk to School. And it actually wasn't primarily a response to climate change. The emergency that got this project going was a declining rate in the percentage of children in the UK who were having the recommended daily amount of physical activity for their health. That was falling off. And so different sectors got together, including planners and city officials and schools and health organizations. And they said, if we can make the routes that children need to walk from their neighborhoods to school safer, mostly that's getting rid of obstacles that were dangerous, like dangerous intersections, we could see more children walking to school. So they put a program like that together. And the cool thing about it is that they carefully measured the benefits. And you see over here that when that's all put in terms of dollars, that the investment was much smaller than the benefits that they saw. So what were some of the benefits? Well, first of all, there was the health benefit. So healthier children actually has lifelong implications for the health system. Parents were spending less money on transportation and fuel to get their kids to school. There was less air pollution. There was less traffic congestion. And all of those taken together was almost a factor of more than 6 to 1 relative to the investment. And here you see a mini capture of the En-ROADS control panel, so energy efficiency of transportation, right? That by having more people walking to school, you're getting basically more miles traveled for less fossil fuel use. So that's how you might connect that to En-ROADS. Here's a second example. This one is from the United States near San Diego. And it's a community that was very precarious because all of its electricity, first of all, was generated by fossil fuels and came at a distance via a single transmission line, which made them vulnerable to storms and to fires that repeatedly took out that transmission line. And so the utility and the community worked together and built a solar microgrid, so renewable energy in the first place with storage for resilience and backup. That meant that even under these conditions of storms or fires, the community would have access to sustainable energy. And in this really hot desert climate, that was actually a matter of health and safety, or even life or death, in terms of people being able to keep their homes cool and keep things like medicine and food refrigerated. So in En-ROADS, we would talk about that as this renewable energy slider, and over here you can see the ratio of benefits to cost for that one. Here's a study about again, emissions from transportation that makes an important point about multi-solving. So this looked at 2 different ways to squeeze greenhouse gas emissions out of the transportation sector. One said, well, let's make the vehicles more efficient. So either higher miles per gallon, or let's move to electric vehicles, some of each. The other scenario was replacing some trips that had been taken by car and having those instead occur by walking or cycling. And so the first thing I'll draw your attention to is that these both made a difference when it came to CO2, kind of similar amount of difference, 38% reduction over here, 35%. Where they were really different was when you looked at premature deaths per million people, so a measure of the health benefits of the two policies. The fuel switching, that helped a little bit, 17 fewer premature deaths compared to not doing anything. But look over here, 530 fewer deaths per million people. That's because of the health benefits of physical activity, right? They were making, in this scenario, safer ways for people to walk and cycle. And that reduced the chronic diseases and deaths that result from lack of physical activity. So one important thing when you start to explore this terrain of multi-solving is to realize that not all climate solutions are created equal, and it's really important to be clear what other co-benefits are possible and how might you need to design your climate solution to also be able to get the benefit of those other improvements. Back to coal again, because it is a well-studied example of what we're talking about, and people were saying this in the chat that Cassandra read out, right? When you heard the variety of different things that would get better if there was less coal, we already know there's less climate damages. That we see that right away in En-ROADS when you see the CO2 emissions line go down when you move the coal slider, right? If the impacts of 1 year's worth of burning coal in the United States are monetized, then this orange or yellow wedge here, that's the impact of the climate damages. Other people were saying, well, folks would be healthier at the site where coal is extracted, right? So here's Appalachian public health. And then we're talking again about respiratory illness and all the diseases related to air pollution, all the way back to that headline that I started with about pregnancy and premature birth. And the first time that I saw this graph, which is from a fairly old study now, 2011, well, the thing that really struck me was that when we keep our conversation focused on climate, when it's what some people call a carbon-centric conversation, we're really only talking about one wedge of a full pie. One wedge of impact, but also one wedge of people who care, one wedge of organizations who are impacted, one wedge of budgets that we might shift in order to make change. And so being able to cogently connect all of these impacts, which all trace their way back to fossil fuels, has this enormous potential to make a lot of things better at the same time, and an enormous potential to build wider coalitions to make change. So hopefully that convinces you what we believe to be true, that if you bring multi-solving into your facilitation, you'll help expand people's sense of vision and possibility. You'll be able to connect people who are focused on climate with advocates for other issues. You'll help people see the potential for collaboration, and you'll broaden the idea or the sort of sense of potential about what a climate solution is. So how do you do that? Well, we think that there's kind of three approaches, and we've done our best in the materials that we've developed to give you hooks or places where you can make connections between En-ROADS and the kinds of co-benefits you see with multi-solving. And the first one is to just work on your own sense of connection between En-ROADS levers and co-benefits. We've done a few things to help you with this, and so I'm going to go back to En-ROADS for a second. And let's stay here with coal. Well, we'll go through the steps. So remember, these 3 dots are super useful, right? When you click on them, you get a whole lot of related graphs. When you click on the help button, you get a lot of information about the parameters, the messages, the dynamics. If you go down a bit further, potential co-benefits of discouraging coal. And I won't read them out because we've been really hitting on this hour, but you'll see here a reminder of some of the things that will get better with less coal use. And so for each of the En-ROADS sliders, there's the same kind of little hints there for you about co-benefits to consider. And there's likely many more that we didn't have the space to include, so be open-minded, do your own research, but that gets you started a bit. A second resource that we have for you is this slide, which you can find in the supplementary slide deck and also on the En-ROADS resources website. So this shows, again, all of the En-ROADS sliders with some of the key co-benefits. This is a great thing for you to have in your back pocket as a facilitator. There might also be settings where you want to make copies of this and hand it out to the groups that you're working with to help improve people's mental models of what else might get better with each of the scenarios that you can create with En-ROADS. So once you start to get familiar with some of these co-benefits, the second thing we urge you to do is find the stories that resonate for your audience. And usually the best place to start is the stories that resonate with you, right? Because if you're excited and passionate about it, a story that will communicate to your audience. And we have, as I said before, collected these stories and tried to make them as usable as possible, or at least some of the stories that are out there. So on our website, if you go to the topics section and then under multi-solving, you'll go to a section called practices and tools, and there you'll find a whole array of resources. I'll highlight them, and hopefully one of my colleagues will put some of these links in the chat for you as well. This is a report we wrote a couple years ago now for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They asked us to do a global scan around the world of places where the health community and the climate community worked together on concrete solutions. And so there's 10 case studies there, really cool things from bike lanes. That walk to school example we looked at was part of this project, and many more. And then last year we added 4 more case studies, and these are at the intersection of climate mitigation, so CO2 or other greenhouse gas reduction, and adaptation, so something that builds resilience. Then the last set of resources is a little bit less in depth, but really broad. We call these applied examples of multi-solving, and it's a collection of dozens of different stories from around the world. Each of them did something to improve or protect the climate and produced other co-benefits at the same time. So there's lots of room for inspiration there. And of course, just keep your eyes out, because multi-solving is it's not a new invention. It's as old as people and communities, and it's the wisdom of do a lot with a little and try to get multiple things done at once. So you'll find examples in your own community, people you know may be leading this kind of work, and really we would urge you to highlight that and celebrate it wherever you can. To try to help you do that, from some of these case studies, we've tried to summarize the examples in a slide or two. So this one is from that health and climate study for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's a project you might have heard about called 𝐶𝑂𝑃𝑌. It started in Colombia, but has been copied now in cities all over the world. And it's a project that takes major streets or highways and closes them off from vehicles for 1 or 2 days a week, and allows people to walk and bicycle and rollerblade and just enjoy the city on foot. So without CO2, but also without noise and dangerous cars, and children can be there. And the health benefits associated with the activity that comes from just having this opportunity has been really studied and well documented around the world. This is another one from the UK. This was an energy efficiency project in hospitals. It was very simple. It was focused on closing doors, turning off lights, turning off equipment if it wasn't in use. And it was training particularly nurses and other staff of the hospitals to do these operations. 2 things happened. They met their climate goals earlier than they expected. And someone had the idea to survey the patients who were in the hospitals while these innovations were going on. And they found patient satisfaction increased, and people actually healed faster. When they looked into it, they found they were getting better night's sleep. People were saying, well, yeah, those noisy beeping instruments that were keeping me up all night, they finally turned the darn things off. And that really motivated the nurses and the doctors who, that's their primary mission, right, is to improve the health and care of their patients. So there was this wonderful synergy between reducing greenhouse gases, saving a lot of money for that health system, and improving the well-being of patients at the same time. The last one I'll share from this section is another favorite of mine. This one from Japan, called Green Curtains, and it was an energy efficiency project focused on reducing the need for cooling in buildings by creating these green curtains that went on the south side of buildings, and you could see the little plants in the picture, right? Over the course of the summer, those plants grow up and make a shade cover. But the second thing they do, they chose edible vines and plants that produced food that could be used in the cafeterias of the companies that were doing these innovations. And this is something that started in Japan after the Fukushima crisis and the energy crisis that came along with that, and has now spread, I understand, to be kind of a common thing across Japan. So the first bit of homework that we'd urge you to do is follow the links that we'll send you in the email, or you'll see them in the chat. Explore our website, find a few examples that you like, and particularly look for ones that you might incorporate into your own personal slide deck, that fit the context in which you often find yourself talking about En-ROADS and climate change. The next thing is to just practice. Like with everything else that we've told you about En-ROADS, that's the key to this. So you'll find in the facilitation materials this question. Maybe you've already encountered it. There's this step in working with En-ROADS where we ask people to consider a near-term co-benefit from your proposal. So how can you address more than one problem with a single action? And maybe just to really bring this home one last time, we'll pop back to En-ROADS. We'll reset everything here, and let's pick one more. This time let's move the deforestation lever, and now let's we're doing an En-ROADS exercise. I just proposed, my team would like to have there be less deforestation, and you're the facilitator. You ask me or my team, what's one near-term co-benefit that might come along with reduced deforestation? And now, assume you're me, type into the chat, tell Cassandra, and she'll read it out. What else might get better about the world if there was less deforestation? And of course, you should be prepared now to do this with all of the levers, depending on what the individuals or the groups suggest. So Cassandra, what are people saying about what might get better if there was less deforestation?
Still waiting for answers to come in.
Okay. So what you want to be thinking about is, big swaths of land that are preserved in healthy ecosystems. What does that mean for nature? What does that mean for water? What does that mean for communities?
We've got wildlife numbers, increased biodiversity and protecting biodiversity, cleaner air, wildlife habitats, indigenous peoples can stay in their homelands, reduce risk of flood.
Right, so people are naming
sequestration.
Awesome. Yeah, people are naming many of the ways that protecting forests produces other benefits. We know that we're in a biodiversity crisis along with a climate crisis. So that first one of more habitat for biodiversity, that's critical. Really important to name the connection between indigenous peoples and forests. And of course, in all of these, co-benefits are just theoretical until you design for them, until you have the right players involved. So if indigenous peoples are able to maintain their traditional claims to their lands, then there is a good chance that preventing deforestation by helping support their stewardship will produce benefits for them. But we all know about deforestation plans that neglect the involvement or the agency of indigenous peoples, and then you would lose that potential co-benefit and potentially do harm. So you really, on all of these things, it's not simple, of course, and you have to really ask, how is it being done and who's involved? Okay, and this slide are a good reminder for me to say that we'll email these slides out to you after the webinar. Here's a few more examples of things that people might say for various sliders about near-term co-benefits. You can always go deeper in the debrief. It's a chance for you to personalize how you would like to take this conversation deeper. A good question is to start with, what are the most intractable problems in addition to climate change in our community? Maybe it's a group of business leaders, like what's the problem in our sector? And then you just want to steer people to how could we address that problem by virtue of how we address climate change. So you can play around with it, be creative, and we're always really interested to hear your experiments of what you find works to open up these conversations. So now we're gonna, in some ways, turn, but in some ways we've been talking about this from the very beginning, right? That climate is not only connected to health and economic opportunity and all these other things that we're talking about, but just like everything else in our world, which, you know, here in the United States is in such stark relief these last 3 weeks with ongoing protests and marches and conversations about racial equity. In other parts of the world, racial equity is also an issue. Maybe it's a different type of equity, gender equity, or economic and class equity, or equity for particular religious or ethnic minorities. It's just clearer and clearer with every day that every choice about the climate has the potential to improve equity, but it also has the potential to worsen it. It has the potential to share burdens fairly, or it has the potential to skew how the burdens are shared. It has the potential to benefit people who may have been somehow, you know, held out of potential for benefit in the old fossil economy. How do we not replicate those same unethical, unequal systems as we go forward? We feel really committed to the fact that every conversation about climate should also be a conversation about equity and justice. And I'll show you some of the ways that we think are helpful to get into that terrain. I will say here, I mean, this is true for the part about multi-solving and co-benefits, but especially the part about equity. Of course, this is not just an intellectual exercise. This is a, for many communities, a matter of life and death, of thriving versus being constrained. And bringing equity into our conversations with En-ROADS is also about leadership and our own stance and how we're showing up as individuals. So I guess my urging and what we're trying to do in terms of walking the talk at Climate Interactive is individually do that work to understand what privilege we have. How can we use that privilege constructively? How can we dismantle these systems that are inequitable in our climate work? So ongoing work and lifetime of work, of course. But here's some ways in the conversations about En-ROADS that we'd have you experiment with. And it will sound kind of familiar because many of the same approaches we've taken as we did for co-benefits. I won't go back to En-ROADS just in the interest of time, but remember the 3 dots that lead you to the information button. I seem to have lost my mouse here, but you can hopefully you can see the orange box there for equity considerations. So that's right beneath the potential co-benefits are the equity considerations. And then we have a similar 1-page guide for each of the En-ROADS sliders, just some of the key points to consider when it comes to equity. We've done the same thing. Some of the case studies that we've focused on and made slides for you to use have an element of focus on equity. Here's just one example of that, a project from Nashville, Tennessee, here in the United States. And this was an energy efficiency project, so it improved the energy efficiency of homes, which is a great climate solution. We know that that will help save money, it will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it will provide good jobs for the people who do the work. The added twist in this project in Nashville was that they explicitly targeted the project towards low-income residents of their communities. And they were focused on a concept some of you might know of called the energy burden. So it's the percentage of someone's income that they need to spend on utilities like heat and electricity. And energy burden, it's well established, is highest for people with lower incomes. They spend a higher percentage of their income on energy and heat. And so by targeting the project in this way, the Nashville Home Uplift Program was able to address one element of inequity in their society while also improving their climate performance. A second example that we are really impressed with, also from the US, from Baltimore, was a project that created and now takes care of an orchard inside of the city of Baltimore. So there's an element of food security, so people are getting food from this orchard. It's benefits in terms of climate change adaptation. So anytime you have green space in a city, it helps cool the urban heat island effect, something that we know will get worse with climate change. Green space also helps to soak up storm water, and many places, including Baltimore, are seeing more intense rainstorms with climate change. And a tie-in between this type of work and inequity is that, at least in US cities, there's a really strong correlation between where the green space is in a city and where the historically African American or other marginalized communities are. There's been study in city after city now that redlining, which was a historic segregation practice that kept African Americans out of certain parts of different cities, the maps of redlining and the maps of green space are very highly correlated. And so interventions that help address that are addressing a historic inequity and also helping in the climate change fight at the same time. So just like you did or will do with co-benefits, when you're leading En-ROADS trainings, you can find moments to ask people as they're moving sliders, how might you ensure that marginalized communities are not disproportionately burdened by whatever that slider move will do? Or how can you make sure that they have access to the opportunities that might come along with that slider? So let's take a quick minute and let's go back to En-ROADS and try that. This time, let's say that someone's really enthusiastic about a carbon price. And so your question for them would be, how would you have to design that carbon price, or what would you have to keep in mind with that policy in order to make sure that inequities aren't worsened, or even to help equity improve? Okay, so what are some considerations when it comes to a carbon price that might have to do with equity? And same as we've been doing, if you type that into the chat, and Cassandra can read out a few ideas. Think about what a carbon price might do to homeowners' energy bills. Think about how a carbon price might ripple through the economy. What do you have to pay attention to make sure that that is an equitable policy?
Someone said a dividend, which I'm guessing they think could be in a way earmarked for social programs. Yeah, carbon dividend, use the money collected to pay dividends to households. Refund the revenue from the carbon price to 90% of poor people.
Yeah. So
yeah, a lot of them are saying that.
One theme that's emerging, I think, is right on, is to think about the revenue that comes along with carbon fees, and how can those revenues be directed in ways that help ameliorate the pain, particularly to low-income families. I think people are they're also thinking about the fact that energy expenditures go up with income usually, and so people paying carbon fees will be, the highest energy users will be paying more, and if part of that dividend then goes to help lower income households not be burdened by the fee, that's a way to equalize how the revenue is spent. I think there's models from places like California where in the statute there are explicit percentages of the fee revenue that needs to be directed toward historically impacted communities for their own projects. So there's lots of good thinking out there. I think these problems are often solvable, but the key thing is that they have to be addressed, that equitable policy doesn't just happen. It happens because of who's in the room at the table and what the intent of the policy is, and whether it includes equity or whether it's only focused on carbon. And obviously we're asserting that you encourage your groups to expand the idea of successful policy to include not just emissions reduction, but also equity. I think you're getting the hang of this. You know, these are just some of the questions we recommend. If we push this lever in our community, what might happen? Are there dangers of inequities being increased? How we need to design the action so the burdens and benefits are shared? Who else might need to be involved? Who might we need to be in order to be good partners to those others who might ideally be involved? I'm going to move along for the sake of time. And again, we're back to practice again. So here we say sometime in the next week, find a friend and have them create a scenario in En-ROADS. And each time they move the slider, discuss how could we promote justice and equity as we make this change. We'd really love to hear about your experiment and what people say. So if you're game, take a picture, put it on Twitter, tag us, or email it to support@climateinteractive.org. And in the follow-up email about this webinar, we'll remind you about these steps. But yeah, please give it a try. The best way to learn about all of this is just to get in there and do it. And certainly in the US, but I think around the world, people are hungry to better understand and act on equity. So I think you'll find people eager to engage with you on this question. In the last few minutes, I want to tell you about a new project we're excited about here at Climate Interactive that we also hope will support you engaging people in this integrated way of thinking where climate change, co-benefits, and equity all come together. And this is really inspired by the unprecedented things we're all going through right now in terms of the pandemic, the economic shocks that are coming from the pandemic, including unemployment and how that's rippling through economies, the clear signals that we have a massive racial justice and equity problem, equity problems of all sorts around the world, and the fact that there are, at every scale we look, people who are finding ways and putting forth ideas about addressing all of these together. So we're calling those actions that are integrated in this way green, resilient, equitable actions for transformation. You can remember that as the acronym GREAT. So great actions are putting all of these pieces together. And because we're so convinced of the power of telling stories, the main thing we're trying to do is capture what some of this creative thinking is. We hope to help inspire a wave of copycats, right? This would be the best kind of copying if cities, states, and nations see what each other are doing and rise to the challenge. So to give you a little flavor of what we're finding, I want to share 3 examples. The first one's at the national level in Nigeria. And this is part of the Nigerian response to the economic impacts of COVID-19. And so with the support of the African Development Bank and the World Bank, they've launched a program to install residential solar systems and microgrids for medical and health centers. So this is either giving energy access to communities that didn't have reliable energy access or substituting fossil energy with renewable energy or both. You can see the many co-benefits from saving money to improved well-being, from better air quality. Now folks aren't burning, say, diesel or kerosene, more reliable power, and energy security. And if we were talking about this in En-ROADS, this would probably be a policy that we would represent by turning up the renewable energy slider, right? I hope a theme of this hour that you're starting to hear me say over and over again is that when it comes to equity, it always matters how these policies are rolled out. So do the communities own and control this new energy infrastructure? What's the process that's used to select which companies, which communities benefit, and who's doing the work, who's creating wealth in deploying these investments? And I'd say the Nigeria policy is just getting off the ground. I think you know, we don't know the answers to all of those questions, but those will be things that we'll be watching. But we're excited at least at the potential of this as an example of putting all these pieces together. At the city level in South America, Medellin, Colombia, a project that's focused on bike lanes and also public transportation, including trains and trams and cable cars. That would would be a combination of electrification of transportation. Some of the bikes they're talking about, I think, was also an electric bike idea, and then probably also the energy efficiency of transportation. Again, the similar benefits around active lifestyles, cleaner air, and so on. Equity considerations, never forget to ask what neighborhoods are going to benefit from these investments. Are they neighborhoods that are already well-resourced? Are they neighborhoods that maybe have been neglected from public spending and public benefit? The third example, and the last one that I'll show you, is from the US, and there's examples of this all over the world. Some of you might live in places that are doing this, that are closing streets to car transportation. Part of the goal is to give people safe spaces to be outside in a socially distant fashion, but also more and more important are creating these corridors for essential workers to get to and from their jobs by foot or on bicycle. And in some places around the world, I'm not sure about Oakland actually, but for instance, I know Seattle, they're talking about some of these changes becoming permanent. So they may well outlast the short-term response to the pandemic. In addition to that, same question about which neighborhoods are benefiting. The other things I'd say about this example are generally we're pretty positive about the equity dimensions of walking and cycling in terms of giving transport options to people who maybe can't afford a car, don't have a driver's license. But of course, the questions always are, in what neighborhoods are those streets safe for other reasons? In the United States, we have, almost daily examples of our streets not being safe places for African American residents and citizens for reasons that have to do with, policing and the prison industrial complex and a whole bunch of things that kind of go in a way beyond this topic, but it's one thing to say the streets are open. Are they open? Are they safe for everyone? So just always coming back to that question, even when we're starting from our stance of focus on climate and clean energy. So what I want to do is just show you, where you can find more. And so we'll go back to the Climate Interactive website for a second. And you'll find, so here under topics, green equitable transformation will take you to this page. And we've divided things up so that you can see policies and actions, open letters, and academic studies. You'll find some of those slides we were just looking at. Other trackers, there's many folks out there who are tracking responses to COVID-19. Our criteria are really specific, right? We're focusing on a climate impact and some attention to equity and justice. And so we won't be including, the best carbon policy in the world if it doesn't seem to also be designed with equity in mind. But there are other trackers that aren't as stringent, and you might be interested in some of those too. So if you click on one of these, you'll see that we've divided things up by city, state, and regional, and plans that are already official and on the books, and plans that are under consideration. We're doing our best to keep things updated, so as plans under review get approved, we're moving them to the other section. You can also zoom in on this map and get links to the same ones, and then short little write-ups about each, and then if you click on these links, they'll take you to the original source. And Cassandra, I'd have you maybe share about how folks could help us with this as well.
Yeah, so if you'd like to click, please submit them using this form so we can. We also create this form. It's at the bottom of the main landing page. So when you go to the main green equitable transformation page, you can scroll down or access it on other pages. If you know of examples that are not included in our database that you think should be, you can use this form and that information will be sent to me. Also, if you see examples in our database that for example, if they're in the under discussion section and you know that they've been adopted, please use this form to also send me that information. Or if you see incorrect information or know of updates to any of the examples, you can send me all of that through this form.
Great. Thanks, Cassandra. So yeah, our commitment to you all is to keep this updated as best that we can. And we think one of the best opportunities to engage decision makers right now, because at all levels, dollars are being mobilized for economic recovery related to the pandemic, to be able to inspire people to direct those dollars toward climate in a way that also increases equity and health and well-being, we think is a giant opportunity. We know that if you look across the world, the dollars are probably still tilted towards non-climate, non-equitable investments, but the saying anything that exists is possible is a little bit of what's motivating us. We think that if Oakland is showing what's possible, other cities can follow in their footsteps and so on. So that's what we'll be collecting, and we hope that it helps inform your efforts. We're going to wind down because we're almost at the end of the hour, and so I guess my last kind of sum it all up thought is I hope that I've conveyed to you that we have a lot of resources to support you. We're here. We want you to find it easy to add equity and co-benefits like health into your facilitation. And at the end of the day, we think the most important thing is, each of you as En-ROADS facilitators and us as a Climate Interactive team embodying this stance that climate doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it's possible to do great harm in trying to address the climate without awareness of these other issues, and that it's truly possible to create a much better world in the short term and the long term by addressing climate in these integrated ways. And probably more than memorizing any set of facts and figures or data about pathways is just really embodying that stance, which is honestly just a systems thinking perspective, because everything is connected. There's ways to move forward that can address multiple issues at the same time. And in a time when we're in multiple emergencies and resources are short, surely finding the ways to address all those issues together is the most effective way to go. So reminder, come back same time next week. Drew Jones will be leading the next webinar, Advanced Facilitation and Questions, and then one final wrap-up, Confidence Building, Testing, and Model Science. I know we haven't left too much time for questions within the hour, but I'm happy to stay. Cassandra will stay, and if questions have been bubbling up, we can try to answer them.
Yeah, so just let me know when you're ready for questions, Beth.
I'm ready. Go for it.
The En-ROADS model and the impact of the sliders point to temperature reduction at the global level. How can we consider co-benefits and equity, which typically are best defined at the local level, when the policy levels on En-ROADS are aimed at global impact? So they're really asking, how do we make the global local? How do you make that connection?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a super insightful question. Thank you. So the question is pointing at the fact that co-benefits are typically local. For instance, if you think about air pollution, it really depends. Are you close to a coal-fired power plant? Then air pollution could be a big change with a climate policy. If you live far from a source of pollution like that, maybe not so much. And so you'll notice that I haven't shown you lots of co-benefits going up and down in En-ROADS, right? We've been talking about stories, we've been talking about how to make connections. And that's partly for that reason that you can't really show local effects in a model that's global. I will tell you one thing we're super excited about in the evolving sort of next generation of En-ROADS, we are going to have a treatment of global air pollution in terms of PM2.5, so one of the small particles that characterizes air pollution, and also jobs at the global level, because different types of energy have different numbers of jobs per unit of energy. So soon you will be able to show the people you're working with air pollution going up or down with different climate and energy choices, and the same for jobs. But for many of the more local impacts, you and all of us have the challenge of connecting and understanding our local environment and what some of the most important challenges and opportunities are.
So another topic that came up a few times when you were talking about coal was some ways to talk about economics or jobs when the benefits such as of reducing coal use accrue widely, but the economic impact of job loss is local and severe. So how do you talk about employment and economic impacts for those communities, as well as energy security for those communities?
Yeah, I appreciate folks bringing that up, because it is definitely true that what might be a net win, more jobs across the country, still could feel like a very severe loss in a community that's dependent, say, on coal. And I think the frame of the just transition and the many organizations that are leading on that work, really have it right there, that to make the speed and scale of change we need to make on climate change is going to require us taking care of each other. And part of who will need to be taken care of are communities that are dependent on fossil energy. And the ideas of that, certainly seems to include job training and reskilling, but probably other health supports and other economic and financial supports to make the transition happen.
Not really more questions coming in. I think a lot of them were answered throughout.
Okay.
Just give me one.
Well, I will say
one theme that did emerge, and it's kind of related to the last question, was how to talk about coal costs, generally speaking, because coal wouldn't be the only one that might have these adverse effects. So how do you, when people bring up the burdens that could be created by some of these actions, what are some ways to handle that kind of discussion?
Do you think do you see what they're getting at, Cassandra? Maybe you could ask the question a different way.
Yes, give me one moment. Apologies, I'm trying to find it.
No, that's okay. I mean, what I would say, I'll take a stab at what I think maybe the question is, of course, the spirit of compassion is part of, I think, our stance as En-ROADS facilitators. That there's this lofty and critically important long-term goal of getting carbon as low as it possibly can. But we should never underestimate the change and turmoil that it will take to get there, and the potential upheaval, and I think coal jobs are a classic example of this. And so a stance or a commitment to the fact that we take care of everyone through this transition is both the ethical and the practical way through that.
Someone asked about if we would consider, if you would suggest drawdown for the metrics on costs.
So project drawdown having estimates of costs of costs of action, I wonder, or costs of some of
costs
the
and benefits.
side effects.
Yes, I think of some of the action.
Yeah, I think you'll find many sources out there. Project Drawdown is worth a look. Another piece of advice I would have is wherever you can, look for full life cycle analysis. If you remember back to that pie chart about coal, one thing that I appreciated about that was looking from the point of extraction all the way through to the point of burning and climate impacts. So those studies are always valuable. And maybe to balance it a little bit, I'll just say one more time, the power of telling stories about some of this. There is certainly a hunger for detail. Give us the numbers, what might it mean for our particular spot on planet Earth? And yet you all know the huge uncertainties about this transformation that we need to go through, that we need to make up a lot of it as we're going along. And so I also think it's helpful to paint a picture of what could be different in this world that we're trying to create. And one of the ways multi-solving seems to help, because it's already happening. You know, in this Robert Wood Johnson study, we found at every scale and every continent we looked across sectors, there were examples of multi-solving. And what we found was that it is an approach, a set of attitudes and practices that really is what can be replicated. And so you may not have to have every last number down to the last decimal point before you can encourage people to act and start experimenting and learning. So yes, go look for solid numbers, but also balance them with stories. That's a little bit of my advocacy.
I don't see new or more questions coming in, so I think.
Great. Well, thanks everyone so much. Really enjoyed this time and your participation, and look for follow-up emails with links to the slides and other good stuff. And enjoy the rest of your day.